Welcome to Counterpoint, an ARPA podcast. We are three ordinary men who love God, God's Word, our families, the church, and our country. In this podcast, we seek to bring a reformed, biblically faithful perspective to social and political issues in Australia. The Association for Reformed Political Action, also known as ARPA, is an Australian organisation which aims to keep you informed about social and political issues in Australia and encourage a Christian voice in the public square. Hello, it's another beautiful day here in WA. Once again, I'm Nathan and I've got Ben next to me. Ben, how are you this morning?
Doing very well. Looking forward to this.
Yeah, sadly, Sean can't make it today. We pray that he'll be with us the next time. And it's another month, so we have another current events episode lined up. Today we're looking at some developments to do with NDIS. It's been in the news a lot lately, and the government has actually made an announcement about that. And then Ben will look at the State Development Act 2025 and some more recent developments in relation to that act as well. And then we've also got another update on the fuel crisis. Hopefully this will be the last one. There was some things we didn't cover last time. There has been a little bit of progress as well in terms of what's happened. So let's get going. NDIS. Well, I think the biggest issue with NDIS is the announcement that the government made just a few weeks ago now that they will cut 160,000 people off the NDIS with the aim to reduce the annual growth from 10% to 2%. So that's government funding, which is allocated to or spent by the NDIS. So for a bit of context, we're looking at a $52 billion black hole in the budget at the moment per year, which is projected to be more than we spend on defence. And for a bit more context, and also I think people were saying that if it continues to grow as it has been, so hitting somewhere around 60, let's say 70 billion a year, NDIS spending will eclipse Medicare and I think the pharmaceutical benefits scheme combined. So basically the government's going to be spending as much money or more money on 760,000 Australians as they do on the health of everyone.
It's off the chain.
Yeah.
Yep.
And now you're dealing with the fact that, yes, NDIS is built to take care of people who need a very high level of support. That's the whole point of having NDIS. We're providing a bit of context. It does seem like way too much money is being spent there, and we would agree on that. But that's what's been happening, and that's why the government's responded. Now, the issue with the announcement is now a lot of people who are on NDIS and currently relying on it are very worried.
Understandably so.
Yeah, that does make sense. And as we go through principles, we will discuss that, and in the 10 minutes that we've got, the way we should look at things and the way things could have been done differently. Another issue which is very important is corruption within the system or abuse within the system. So you've got dodgy providers, you have reports of providers just using it to get money. The money is seen as free, and what they're actually doing then is they're, what do you call it?
They compel people to
Yeah.
sign up, make possibly false reports, and then just collect.
Yeah, or you're dealing with people who have real problems,
Yeah.
but you compel them and
Yeah.
you control their lives and you take the money and then you benefit off it and you're not actually caring for the people that you're meant to. So yeah, there's a lot of corruption within the system. Now, you're going to have your politics around this because Labor are going to say, well, the problem with this, and in fact they have been saying this, Bill Shorten has, the problem with this is that there's not enough control over it. You don't have certifying or registration for providing. Anyone can just become a provider.
Yep.
So you really need to set things up, and the government really needs to be able to police it properly as well, which would lead to more spending because you need to employ people to do this.
Yeah.
And spend money on it all.
I would just note this is another example of how complex systems always tend to increase in complexity.
Yes.
And it's very difficult for a managerial or bureaucratic system to throw it in reverse. And that is, regardless of what area they're involved in, the only thing that our managerial system seems to be able to do to try and solve a problem is to add another layer of complexity. So they add another set of checks and balances or certificates or departments in order to now vet all of the people who are going through these things, which is, yeah, I'll just leave that there.
Yeah. Well, you'll be expanding on that very soon.
I will.
But yeah, I think that's part of the issue. And one of the things we're going through in our topical episodes when we're looking at family is we're realizing that the way God created things is to be local. So God's actually created things so that, I guess, endeavors or entrepreneurship or help and support done in a local context is the best.
Yep. Another way to say this is if you don't keep the large laws, it's not that you have no law, it's that you will have a million small laws.
Yeah.
And you will have a lot of lawyers in order to enforce them.
Yeah, we have more lawyers than defense personnel. The bureaucracy is expanding to meet the ever-expanding needs of the bureaucracy.
Correct.
As someone who's played Civilization, I heard that a lot. So yeah, after that small diversion, so what is the problem? And there was a very interesting interview between Karl Stefanovich. It was on his show. He had Bill Shorten on, and someone who's from the media, is a fairly young guy, who's been looking at the corruption in the NDIS and reporting on it, sharing about it. So I should have got his name up. I don't have it here. But Bill Shorten, he actually let it slip in that interview. Now, I don't think that was his intention. But he basically said one of the issues they have is that wherever government money goes, corruption follows. Now, for him, the solution is more government, as we just said. Perhaps we should actually think about whether or not the government should be running this in the first place.
You could see the contradiction because if government money flows, then corruption flows. Okay, the government understands that. What is the only tool that the government has is more government.
Yeah.
And you kind of feel for the guy because what are you going to do? You are in the government and this is the control of power which you have.
Yeah.
How else are you going to solve the problem, right?
Yeah. As people say, the government, basically their tool is coercion.
Yeah.
And we know that from scripture, they bear the sword. So the government's tool is the sword.
Yeah. I would differentiate between, well, there's obviously different types of governments as well. And the way that we think of our liberal managerial system as it is now, filled with bureaucracy, is not at all what would have been experienced in Roman times or in feudal times or even a few hundred years ago. The amount of control that the government has because of the managerial system and the bureaucracy is just unparalleled.
Yeah, I would actually argue that it's more helpful when you understand government to separate government from administration.
Yes. Yep.
But then what's government? And that brings me to my next point. Ultimately, there is very little accountability for government spending. And that's the issue, because nowadays you think, oh, but they can get voted out. But how much do we, the public, really know about what's being spent? And are people being called to account? I'm just going to throw it out there because we don't have time to discuss it properly. But I'm going to say there's very little accountability. God has mandated that the government are the ones to provide accountability, to ensure that there isn't corruption, to ensure that greed is dealt with and theft is dealt with. But if they're the ones who are actually providing the money, then there's a conflict of interest. There's that issue. That's just a systematic issue with the way in which we're doing things, where we've got one institution which is meant to be the lawgiver, meant to be the judge, but also now is also the provider.
Yep, well said.
And then the next one is scope creep. NDIS was firstly intended only for those who cannot care for themselves. So you're talking about people who really, really need help. They need a very high level of support. But what's happened is pretty much it's become the one size fits all. Everyone goes on NDIS, smaller programs, more local, or let's say state-run programs, maybe community-run programs. They've disappeared because they figure you might as well just put anyone on NDIS. For a bit of context around here, people are quoting that I think 16% or so of 5-year-olds or 6-year-old boys have been diagnosed with autism and therefore are on NDIS. It's pretty crazy numbers. And then the last one is just simply that with the way things work, and this is true about welfare as well, if you give people money for doing nothing, then one, they might misspend the money. I've heard it said that, for instance, people on NDIS, because they have a lot of money and they don't know what to do with it, they end up just wasting it. And you don't really have that sense of satisfaction or fulfillment that you've earned what you're getting.
Yeah, and I would say it's just gone well beyond the stated intention, which was as a means to help. And this is always the problem when you have a large institution which is attempting to care for literally hundreds of thousands of people. How can you do that? The problem is essentially there's not a personal, human scale, loving relationship between the person who's providing, which is in this case not really a person, it's like a gigantic institutional entity, and the provided, or those who are provided for. And for us to solve that problem as a society, my view as a Christian man, I would say this is the kind of thing that we solve in our own communities. And I recognize the fact that the government has stepped in because there was a failing on behalf of many of the families in our nation. And I think the government would be well served by calling that out to begin with and saying, look, this is a human scale problem. And we call on the community to step up and to help to solve these problems and to empower, to make ways for the different leaders, different people who are able, who have a heart for it, who have a deep love, because there are many people who have a real love and a desire to care for these people who have these needs, and to seek to empower them rather than trying to fill the gaps. But I totally understand. I take my hat off to the government and the work that they have attempted to do, because it is a really tricky problem to solve. Like, what do you do when literally hundreds of thousands of people, parents and kids, and all of the support structures around them have failed and they don't have a solution?
I think it's well said, but I will push back against this failed notion. What tends to happen is you have an isolated problem. Let's say one person, or let's say two people. The media makes a big uproar about it, and next thing government is brought in as the solution. And then what happens after that is things just get worse because the problem has been misdiagnosed. One analogy I used just before we started. So let's say my computer mouse has a problem. So what do I do about replacing it or fixing the problem? Now the logical thing and the sensible thing is just to buy a new mouse that costs $50. But NDIS is basically the solution where you buy a whole new computer. Computer, monitor, keyboard, mouse. That way, you fix the problem. But you've also paid $2,000 in doing it.
That's exactly right. It's a very good example.
So like using a sledgehammer to hit in a nail. But in this case, you're fixing the problem. There's just a lot of waste and you really lose the heart. And that's the issue. You lose the heart. You lose the fact that what you want to be doing is encouraging support to be done in a local context where you've got people who care about those who are being supported. And look, that happens on the ground. I've heard many success stories with NDIS. So we're not saying that's not the case. We're not saying that good work doesn't get done. It's just that the wrong people in the end are running it. That's the issue. So yes.
It's a wrong sledgehammer.
Yeah, I had a few
kind of nail.
Yeah, I had a few principles to work with. And one is that there are people who need special care. That's a given. And we acknowledge that that's the case. But the issue is, because I actually believe NDIS shouldn't exist. Not that the care doesn't get provided, but NDIS as an organisation run by the government shouldn't have happened in the first place. And why do I believe this? Well, Ben just said it, that things should be done locally by people who care. And there's also what God says in Scripture. 1 Timothy 5 verse 8. Look, we're probably quoting this text a lot in the context of family already. But there Paul says, "But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever." And then we also have what Paul says in Galatians 6 verse 10, which is a fairly well-known passage where he encourages people to do good to all, especially those of the household of faith. So what you do, and this is something we do quite naturally, is you look to the family for support, and if any extra is needed, you look to the next level, the wider community. In our cases, it's churches a lot, but there are many other, there's charities, for instance, local charities, community around people. And in an age when we're losing community, I think this is actually, it's sort of a chicken and egg situation. Part of the reason I think we're losing community is because big institutions like the government are taking over projects which should be done in a community. And then if someone's misusing the funds, well, he's living next door to you, you're more likely to know about it, and that can be dealt with. And yeah, those are the principles we've got here when it comes to NDIS. So yes, there are a lot of people concerned about what might happen. Might they lose their funding? Might they lose their support? And they don't see another way. But what we should really be encouraging is look out for the person next to you.
Yeah.
So if you know someone who's on NDIS, how can you help? How can you support? And just reduce their reliance on government money, ultimately.
Very good. Next up, the State Development Act. We'll be flying through this. Okay, so December last year, it passed a law which creates a new fast-track framework for priority projects. So any project which is deemed of strategic or economic significance now has a vehicle. Now, this law has not quite been assented yet, but it is on the books. And it's been sold publicly as trying to fix WA's broken approval system, which definitely needs fixing. However, we will just lay out what this looks like, and I'll have some thoughts at the end. So, priority premium track for big projects to get approved. So there's 3 powers. First, there's a designation of the priority project. And so this is where the minister and the premier jointly can nominate any project they consider to be economically significant. And note here, there are no objective criteria. There's no public consultation required, and there's no excluded project types. So nuclear, fracking, and coal are all eligible, along with any other project. There's no exclusions. So the minister and premier together can decide on anything that they wish to nominate for this priority pipeline. Then once a project has been designated, then the minister has the authority to rewrite or switch off provisions for pretty much any WA law. It includes a massive list. So just a couple of highlights: the Environmental Protection Act, Planning Act, Heritage Act, Mining Act. Pretty much any rule of the bureaucracy that you can think of can be switched off by the minister at his discretion once a project is in this pipeline. And the minister can also impose deadlines on any statutory decision maker. So any of these bureaucracies who manage these acts, so the EPA or the Heritage Council or the Planning Commission, they get a deadline from the minister and they have to have a very good explanation as to why they missed that deadline. And there's no explicit penalty. So they've basically built a platinum class system for projects to get through. Now there's a new office called the Coordinator General, who is appointed by the governor, and there are no qualifications for this office. The explicit function is to assist the project proponents to navigate the system. And there's no conflict of interest provisions, and there's no public consultation obligations. So, in a word, this is like the purest form of cutting through red tape that you can possibly think of. This basically appoints something of a czar to be able to choose which projects can go, and then away they go. And they can do whatever they wish. And obviously there's a couple of power concentration problems with this. Premier Roger Cook is also currently the Minister for State Development. So he holds both hats at the moment. So he can designate the project as a priority project, then he can approve the modification order, and he can sign off as the premier. So there's a one-man band in town at the moment.
Yeah, but it's got 2 hats.
Very good. He's got 2 hats. Very good. Yeah, and as mentioned before, there's no exclusions for nuclear, fracking, or coal. Now, there are federal restrictions on a number of these, particularly nuclear, for example, or other projects which fall under the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, which is a federal law, which is the only external check on this priority project pipeline at the moment. And this leads me to the second interesting thing which has recently happened in the last 2 weeks. So the law was passed and it went out on the WA Gazette December last year. It's just waiting for assent, but as soon as that assent comes through, then that will become law. However, in the last 2 weeks, we got notification that there was a memorandum of understanding between the WA government and the federal government. So Cook and the federal environment minister signed a memorandum of understanding to hand the job of assessing federal requirements under this Environmental Protection and Conservation Act to WA as well. So they're making a new bilateral agreement which will basically waive the rights of the federal government to have this check and just give it over to the WA government as well. Now, that hasn't actually happened yet. There's more communication going on. They're building a bilateral assessment deal for that, and they expect to have that done by the end of 2026 with deals actually to come through in the next year. So there are still also some hard federal carve-outs that remain. Coal and gas, water, trigger projects. There is still the power of the minister to get called in, and there's a couple of unacceptable impacts. This stuff is still being worked out.
So is that the federal government pretty much just holding the state government to account over certain things?
Yeah.
Okay, but it's much more limited than previously.
Yep. So yeah, this is a pretty big deal. A couple of implications. Obviously, in the new year, you have one guy, if you have a large corporation, a mine, for instance, who wishes to set up a new mine and they don't want to go through the regular channels, or they're having a lot of trouble getting approved, this allows the government to approve projects. So for big business, this is obviously a win. This means that probably for the WA economy, it's not a bad thing either, just in terms of how much work actually can get done. Basically, it's cutting red tape for the select few, leaving the red tape on for the rest of us. But for the select few, they are able to go to this one guy and have a chat to him and say, look, this is what we want to do. This is the kind of trouble we're running into. Can you make those troubles go away? And now he can.
The cynic in me is thinking that the Premier is going to have a lot of nice high-paying jobs lined up for him once he's done. A bit like our previous Premier.
Yes, it certainly does tend towards a patronage relationship. But the reality is that I would say, look, the fact is you're always going to be run by the organized few over the disorganized majority. And while I do understand, obviously the rules are in place for a good reason, right? Like over many years, we've built up this set of rules as to how things get approved and how we decide what projects are not going to pollute our waters and kill all the fish and all the rest of it. And that's good, right? However, we have obviously run into a roadblock where it's pretty much impossible to get any major infrastructure projects like mines or gas projects or power plants or large smelters or anything like that. We don't do any of that here, and we just offshore it all and then import it back. And if anything about the fuel crisis, which is coming up next, tells you, that's probably not a good place for your sovereign country to be. In fact, that's not a very sovereign country. So a movement in this direction is not a bad idea. However, the huge amount of responsibility which is placed on one man without any checks and balances is a bit dangerous.
And then you mentioned it, that Coordinator General Office. So what we're dealing with here is the solution to too much government, like too much red and green tape and whatever else, and industrial relations laws, all those things which are really hampering business owners in Australia, whether it's big business owners or the small ones. And even tax regulation, like international companies are just given a free ride in a lot of ways compared to Australian companies. The solution to all that, too much government, is let's create a new office. So it's to create a loophole. And then what does this loophole do? It circumvents the whole process. As you said, it circumvents even the local consultation. It circumvents that, and it circumvents the reasons why you have these regulations, which were created, I think, because of real problems. Like, you do need some level of accountability for what happens with the environment. You do need to ensure that the waterways won't get polluted. All of that can just get circumvented by the stroke of a pen.
Doesn't necessarily mean that it will either.
Yeah.
This is the thing. It's a responsibility. With great power comes great responsibility. And this man will hold the power. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean he will misuse it, right?
Yes.
But we should be skeptical of those things. And we just wanted to bring it to your attention that this is the way our system is changing. And that explicitly now there is a recognition by the managerial elite, by the bureaucracy, which says, look, obviously we can't get done what needs to happen. And we still need to get it done. So we're going to make a new way.
Yeah. I think what's brought this on is the realization that productivity is a real issue in Australia. But the solution just seems to be misguided. And once again, how's it going to help people in a local context? People with their small businesses? I think if anything, it will make it worse. It just helps the big guys.
Yep. It's true. I would say the problem is that if you're going to take this, I would take it. The problems are delayed, right? Because you're probably going to get corruption of some kind down the line, right? But the alternative is we just never have any manufacturing ever in Australia, like smelting or any, like we don't have any large projects anymore because it just gets totally killed always by environmental regulation.
Yeah. Or we could actually fix that, but that's going to be much harder to do.
Exactly. That's the thing. It's like
you've got a lot of bureaucracy.
Yeah.
All these acts to go through and make sensible again. So I can understand this is a very quick and easy solution, but there are concerns about it.
Which leads to the fuel crisis update.
Fuel crisis update. Yes. So apparently the solution to a lack of fuel is taking the roof racks off your car, pumping up your tires, and driving much more efficiently.
Is that the official government advice?
Well, they spent $20 million telling us how to drive properly, according to one headline. So yeah. Now, is there a crisis or not? We talked about it in the last one, but the government message is quite inconsistent, the messaging from especially the federal government. One day there is a crisis, one day there's not. There was a fire at one of the 2 refineries in Australia, which will affect output. And once again, it's a crisis, but it's not.
There's no crisis, but let me just go meet with Singapore for a minute and make sure that we definitely do not have any crisis. Definitely not.
Yes. Pretty much. Like Penny Wong has been very busy. She's the Minister for Foreign Affairs. She's been running around Asia trying to ensure that we have supply. In the meantime, in WA, we've had the government buying and storing reserves of diesel. And the other governments are crying foul over that. I think they organised it with BHP, whoever's supplying BHP's fuel. Members of the government and senior bureaucrats were told to ration. Cancel holidays, cancel unnecessary trips. So we did actually have the government taking the lead in this. They're not forcing the people to, which is interesting.
Hats off. Well done.
Yep. And they declared a state of emergency to force fuel companies to be transparent about their suppliers, where they're coming from and how much they've got. So we'll see whether or not that is a valid move. One big question in Australia, will we or won't we build new refineries? We've had, I think, the Queensland Premier and possibly even New South Wales offer to set up refineries in their states. But the federal government, Chris Bowen, has been quite adamant that no, we're not going to build any new refineries. So at the moment, it's a case of will he or won't he? And look, Nick Oran has also spoken about this. in one of his weekly updates. Now, the issue here is not refinery capacity. It's supply. We get our fuel from refineries in like Singapore, China, Korea, possibly Malaysia. They weren't affected, but it was more the issue that they weren't getting the oil which they used to have. So having more refineries in Australia would not have solved this crisis. It might have helped a little bit because we could get crude and then refine it here rather than making the pipeline longer. So yeah, that's not really dealing with the issue. The issue is actually, where does the oil come from in the first place? How do we get it out of the ground? What I'm not saying, though, is that we shouldn't increase our refinery capacity. I think Australia should ultimately aim to be self-sufficient. We can be, so we should aim to be.
Yeah. And this is the thing, because Australia does have large reserves of oil and coal and gas. We do have the ability, like we have the technical ability to build these refineries. We have 2 of them operational. We have sunsetted a number of them over the last few years. So it's certainly an option. And to me, one of the primary drivers has been this, as we've talked about last time as well, the idea that free shipping, or not free, but very low cost shipping of fuel and other refined fuel products makes it almost impossible for Australian refineries to compete. So to me, it really does have to be a government-led initiative, either with tariffs of some kind or subsidies, making it possible for local companies to build out that infrastructure again. But yeah, the fact of the matter is that we just do not have a very receptive government to that idea right now. Federal government, at least. All the states maybe. Now, it might be interesting what happens if you imagine what's happened in WA with the priority projects. What could happen later on if Liberal government got back in, or a government, even just a Labour government that was more amenable to these ideas? We could actually get something off the ground here.
I was actually thinking this is related to the previous one, but let's say a refinery gets deemed as a priority project. The issue is still costs and running costs. They're too high for it to be viable without some level of government support.
But this is one of those things where it's like the federal government does have an interest in it because you could very easily make the case that this is a national defense issue. If you have a kind of angry China, for example, who stops up all your Southeast Asian supply of refined fuels, then suddenly you no longer have any sort of army or navy or air force. So that's a big problem.
Well, as I said last time, this is warning number 2 for our government. The first one was COVID, what happened there around supply, because ports were shut down. And then we've got this, which is just 20% of the world's oil supply. It gets affected, and then look what happens in Australia, especially when it comes to diesel. Now, the thing is that people have been waiting for a conflict between China and Taiwan for years. Hopefully it won't happen. We really pray that it won't happen. But if it does, Australia is in deep trouble, because a lot of our refined fuels come from that area and would be affected. So that's why we're saying, it's a warning, and we should really be looking at refining capacity, but also supply, working on building supply in Australia, exploring, and starting up oil projects, continuing with gas projects, encouraging us to be self-sufficient. And it's not only oil and gas, it's fertilizers as well for the farmers. There's a lot of farmers who are concerned. They're concerned about diesel, they're concerned about fertilizer. And when the cost of that goes up, it also affects the cost of food, or it even affects whether farms can keep going. It's really difficult. Okay, a couple of other things. First, the Australian government is subsidising Australian-flagged cargo ships now. So one issue we've had with Australia is because of things like, once again, red tape. That's a common theme. We don't actually have any nationally flagged cargo ships or oil tankers. And this is really important because in times of shortage, the military or the government can call up these cargo ships to transport priority goods. But if we don't have that, then they can just say, no, it's too dangerous, we're not doing it. So we're really reliant on the goodwill of others without that. So the Australian government is starting to make that move. That's a good move. Once again, we should have that capacity, we should have that capability anyway. But it's another thing which we've just let slip in the last few decades. And this is one I wanted to get to last time, so hopefully we've got a couple minutes to discuss. Maybe it'll be a one-word answer, but are EVs the solution? Because you might think, well, without fuel, well, then why don't we just drive electric cars? And I'm pretty sure Chris Bowen's mentioned that at some point at the start. So yeah, are EVs the solution?
Maybe. I'm not going to say a hard yes or a hard no. Obviously, refined fuels from oil and gas are the most efficient way to store energy that we have ever discovered as a human race. Like, it is just phenomenal how much energy you can store in a contained space.
I'd argue nuclear is more dense, but yeah.
True, but you can't really have a nuclear reactor powered car. At least not at this stage.
No, there'll be a few safety concerns about that one.
But yes, can you really pivot to EVs? Obviously, people always have the objection that, well, you need to power the EVs with something. The grid already has a lot of strain. There are a bunch of, I have heard recently about a couple of large scale or larger scale AI data centers, which are actually going up in Perth. And those things can suck back a stack of power. So you need to ensure that your grid is actually sustainable before you're going to pivot all of the, say, trucking, for example, which is the vast majority of where diesel will go. To me, that really is the question is, are truck EVs possible? Is that at scale going to be a solution to replace diesel? And to me, I just don't really see that as yet. The thing is, there have been a lot of developments over the last, even just in the last 20 years of what batteries can actually do. So I am skeptical. Look, Australia does have a lot of mines already. It's possible for us to refine that product down into batteries. We could build a entirely self-sufficient stack of fuel in-house, but we can do that already with a time-tested technology like gasoline or diesel. So yeah, I would say to most people thinking about it, let's just not have to do everything immediately. Let's just allow some time for technologies to mature and for the best thing to win out. We want to build a sovereign capacity in-house. And then how does that shake out? Is that diesel? Is that gasoline? Is it natural gas? Is it EVs? Is it solar panels? The thing is, if you're going to be honest about it, the vast majority of the solar comes from China at a very cheap price, and it's subsidized by the government of China. Yeah. So if you take that away, or if you put a tariff and say, look, we're going to be equal across the board, all energy incoming to Australia is going to take this kind of a tariff, and we're going to keep an eye on this kind of stuff that's getting internal subsidies as well and account for that, right? And then see, okay, now what actually is the most efficient and the kinds of technologies which can still meet our environmental regulations. Now, that's going to be a tall order. But I think if you're to set that as your goal and say, look, we do want energy independence and we want to do that in a sustainable way, which is actually like, it's not just running up our government deficits. And we want to still at the same time maintain relatively clean air, clean water, not massive outputs of tailings ponds of horrible chemicals from the batteries, then hold all the three of those things strongly and see what industry can come up with.
So I guess my dream of small modular reactor powered cars is not dead quite yet. So imagine you wouldn't have to fill that thing up for 10 years. People would love it. But yeah.
Put it on the table, man. See what comes out.
Yeah, my thoughts are along those lines. And I think it's important to understand what's the problem here. And the problem isn't a lack of oil. The problem is a lack of energy sovereignty, as you mentioned. Now, if we transition to EVs in the current climate, well, we're relying on China in a lot of ways, or even maybe other countries for EVs. In China is where all the refining for lithium happens.
The vast majority, yeah.
The vast majority of it. So would be just as dependent, if not more so, on countries like China. And the other thing is as well, EVs are heavily subsidized in Australia to make them affordable.
Yeah.
Which is not a good solution. So basically what we're doing in a nutshell is we're enriching China at the cost of Australia already. Buying more EVs would just make that worse. So yeah, just non-controversial statement of the day to finish off with. So our answer to that is no. They're not solution. Energy sovereignty and looking at EVs could be a solution in the future, but looking at building Australia's capacity. And I'd say this isn't just about oil. it'd be good to get our car industry up again. Andrew Hasty's got work to do.
Mate, he's pounded the table, I'll tell you what.
Yep. Keep sending us these pictures and these videos of you with your classic Holden. Eventually it might work.
Good on him.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll wrap it up. Thanks once again for listening. Ben, take us home.
Yeah, if you haven't already, make sure that you do hit that like button and subscribe. Leave us a rating and review, whatever your podcast platform you're listening to. My name is Ben. You've been with me and Nathan. And if you do have any feedback for us or any topics that you'd like us to cover, please reach out, arpacounterpoint@gmail.com.
And as always, we'll finish off with a prayer that God's kingdom will come.